Our scripture reading this morning comes out of Genesis 45, but again, we are going to be looking at Genesis starting about chapter 42 and going all the way through 50 today. So if you want to follow along, you'll have to do a lot of page turning, but that would be encouraged. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And when they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to prepare for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God, who made me father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt." Joseph is 39 years old now. He has been in Egypt for longer, 22 years, than he had spent 17 years living in the land of Canaan with his family. Do you think that Joseph ever looked out his window and looked to the northeast and wondered about his family in Canaan? Did he know that his father was still living? No. Did he know if his brothers were still living, how they were faring, how they were doing? Do you think he remembered his dream? Remember the dream that he had, that he shared with his family, and then he shared with his brothers, where he said that I saw my sheaf of wheat stand up, and I saw all of your sheaves of wheat bowing down before me? Do you think he remembered any of that stuff anymore? All he knows now is that he has people from all over the ancient Near East coming to him and bowing at his feet and asking that he would feed them, because only Egypt has food to survive this drought. There had 7 years of plenty, but those 7 years have been forgotten. We are now 2 years into the drought, and there are still 5 more years to go. How do you think people view Joseph? Or do you think that when they come and ask him for food, are they terrified? Do they see him as cruel and vindictive? Are they, angry at him? Or do you think they see him as benevolent, as a savior, that he had the foresight to see ahead that this famine was coming and that he was going to be able to provide for them? All we know is that Joseph had spent years, 13 years, as a slave, as a prisoner, and now all of a sudden he is in second in command of all of Egypt, and he has incredible power over everything and over everyone. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Joseph's brothers are alive. But the famine has reached Canaan, and they are now starving. And so Jacob, his father, hears that there is food in Egypt. And yet his sons, his 10 remaining sons, actually 11, will not go to Egypt. And he doesn't know why they don't want to go to Egypt. But he knows that something is up, because he says, "Why are you looking at each other? Why are you looking at each other? You know that there is food in Egypt. Why don't you go and get food for us?" Well, Jacob is always the last to know what's going on now. Ever since he deceived his own brother and father, he is always on the wrong side now of deception. He was deceived by his uncle Laban. He was deceived by his wives. He was deceived by his sons when they told him that, when they allowed him to think that Joseph had been destroyed by a wild animal, rather than telling him that they had sold him into slavery. And all he knows now is that his 10 sons need to go to Egypt. They need to buy food for him, and they won't go. Why won't they go? is because it reminds them of what they have done. These 10 brothers are forced into an uneasy alliance. They don't trust each other. And why would they? They're not trustworthy people. Reuben had slept with his father's concubine. Judah, I think, was so distressed by what they had done that he goes and he lives in Canaan for a while. And we have that whole episode where we read about Tamar a couple of weeks ago. These are not trustworthy men. These are not honorable men. And yet they are forced into a relationship with one another because they know that if one of them spills the beans, then all of them are going to be caught. And so they have to trust each other, although none of them wants to do so. And they know that if they go to Egypt, that it's going to remind them of what they have done. And what if by chance Joseph is still alive? What if they were to discover him? Then what do they do? Do they rescue him? Do they bring him back? They're in a no-win situation. They have a guilty conscience. Their conscience is so guilty, in fact, that whenever anything bad happens to them, they're convinced that God is judging them. How many of you are old enough to remember little Abner? You remember the little guy who always had the cloud over his head and everything was like Joe whatever, it just had a whole bunch of, syllables, that, is what his name is? That's what Joseph's brothers are like now. They always have a cloud over their head. It's always raining on them. Even when something good happens to them, they can't enjoy it because they know that the other shoe is going to fall. Have you met people like that? We call them pessimists. It's always raining. It's always bad. Even when things are good, it's going to get bad. And that's what Joseph's brothers are like. They're depressing people to be around. And so now they feel guilty. The reason they feel guilty is because they are. That's our first preaching point. But it's a preaching point we really don't need to preach, do we? And that we are guilty. We are sinners. And we don't like to admit it. We don't want to have to acknowledge it. This last week, we went to Omaha to see graduation of number one grandson. And one of my son-in-laws subscribes to a men's magazine called Men's Health. I don't know if you've ever seen Men's Health magazine, whatever. It has weightlifter guys on it, big muscles and stuff. And I was reading an article when I was there because in between times of being bored. And one of the articles was on that guilt can make you sick. And I went, duh. And the guy who was writing this article had some medical revelation that he thought was just the most cool thing, where he had found evidence that if you have a guilty conscience, that if you keep secrets, that cortisol levels go up in your blood and that you are prone to heart attacks and strokes. And I went, well, duh. Scientists have known that for years. The Bible speaks of this for over 4,000 years, where David writes about, I have sorrow and pain in my bones because of the guilt and the sins that I am carrying. This is not new. But what is new, and again, this isn't really new, is how we try to deal with guilt and sin in our lives, and that we deny it. We pretend that it doesn't happen. And in our society today, our pop psychologists, our psychiatrists, our psychologists, our television talk show hosts, all they try to affirm us is that we should not feel guilty because sin is not my fault. You heard that? I'm not responsible for my sins. It's systemic. It's society's fault. And so then we've watered down what sin is. Nothing is immoral anymore. Nothing is really wrong anymore. And so if it's not immoral, if it's not wrong, why should I feel guilty? Why should I feel like I have sinned? Have you heard that? Am I the only one who's catching that as to what's happening in our society? And so we say that the highest ethic is love, and as long as everything is done in love, it's okay. And that isn't true. Because love that's done out of a selfish motive is still immorality. It's still wrong. And so people have strokes, they have heart attacks, their cortisol levels go up, they put on weight, we don't feel good, and we wonder why. And the reason is because we're guilty. People feel guilty for a reason. We are guilty. God has put a law within us that we know that certain things are wrong. And even when we try to convince ourselves that it really isn't, it bothers us because we know that things are wrong. Well, Joseph's brothers have a guilty conscience because they're guilty. And they're miserable. And they're making each other miserable. But they're starving. So they have to go to Egypt. And when they get to Egypt, the story takes another twist here. And that they do discover Joseph, only they don't know that it's Joseph. But Joseph knows that it's them. Now, they don't recognize Joseph because when they last saw Joseph, he was 17 years old. Now this man before them is 39 years old, and he looks like an Egyptian, he sounds like an Egyptian, and he is in a place of incredible authority. He is the second most powerful man of all of Egypt. And they have to go before him, and they have to beg him for food in order that they might survive. Now, they didn't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognized them when they came. Now, most of the time, I've always heard the story this way, and most of you probably heard this story this way, is that we hear the story of Joseph as being a story of forgiveness. I would argue with us today that this is not a story of forgiveness. I think Joseph, when he saw his brothers, he was ticked. He was hurt. He was angry. He wasn't sure if he would ever see his brothers again. He didn't know if they were alive. And when he sees his brothers, we are told that he addresses them sternly. He says, "You guys are spies. You're coming to spy out the land. You want to see the nakedness of the land." I think Joseph is having flashbacks. I think he's thinking that the last time he saw his brothers, he was 17 years old, and they stripped the coat of many colors from him. And his older brother Reuben, he says, "Well, let's not kill him outright. We don't need his blood on our hands. Let's throw him in a pit, and we'll let him starve to death, and then we don't need to worry about him." And then his brother Judah says, "Oh, let's get some money out of him. Let's sell him to these Ishmaelites, and we'll let him be a slave in Egypt. And we can just forget about this brother of ours that we love to hate." And so here's Joseph. He's in the bottom of a pit. He's pleading with his brothers to help him, to save him. They're ignoring him. They're sitting up on top of the pit eating their lunch. And so now Joseph has situations reversed. His brothers are the ones that he can throw into a pit. His brothers are the ones that he can send back to Canaan to starve to death. And I think he thought about it. He thought, these guys are louses. They're terrible people. They were unjust to me. I spent 13 years in a prison because of these guys. Why in the world would I give them food? Why in the world would I save them? But he remembers his dream. You remember the dream. He remembers the dream where he saw the sheaves and his brothers kneeling down before him. And I think Joseph puts it all together now, and he realizes that the dream is not about him. The dream is about the provision of God, that God sent him ahead of them in order to provide a remnant to save his people. And so Joseph, I think, starts to think about this, and he's having to wrestle with his emotions, and he's having to wrestle with all of these things that are happening within him. And so he comes up with a test. Now, I don't know if he thought about this test premeditatively or whatever it was, but he thinks of a test as to what am I going to do? And so he finds out from his brothers that his father is still alive. And he finds out that his youngest brother Benjamin is alive. And he wonders, are they persecuting Benjamin like they persecuted him because of who their mother was, their father's favorite son, Rachel? And so he says, okay. He throws them in jail, all of them in jail, and they're sitting in the jail for 3 days, and he says to them, okay, I'm going to send one of you back to get your youngest brother Benjamin. And if you bring him back, then you are honorable men. And then he amends that. He says, okay, instead of sending just one of you back, I'll send all but one of you back. And if you come back, I will know that you are honorable men. The test here is that his brothers abandoned him and lied to their father to save themselves. They have the opportunity to do the same thing again. They can abandon their brother, take the food, and go back to Canaan and never return. And he'll know whether they were honorable men or not. To complicate matters, he takes the money that they had used to pay for their food and puts it back in their sack. Now that would be a blessing, right? Free food. They open up their sack because they're like that Joe, what's his name, from Little Abner. They're thinking, oh my gosh, he's going to think we stole from them. And so rather than being blessed, they're terrified. They go back to Canaan. They have some explaining to do to their father. We have food, but we have the money. We're missing one of our brothers. If you're Jacob, what are you thinking? They sold him. They sold one of my sons for food. I mean, it's not a good situation. And yet, they're trying to explain all of this stuff. And it's just a horrible, horrible situation. Well, eventually they run out of food again. They say to Jacob what the requirements for the test are, that they have to take Benjamin with them. Jacob is distraught. He's already lost one son, Joseph, who he thinks is dead. He's lost Simeon, who is in prison, who is a slave in Egypt. And he knows that if they take his favorite son, his last remaining son to his one Rachel, Benjamin, that he'll never see him again, that he will be distraught. And so now Judah and Reuben, the two most guilty of the older brothers, they come up to Jacob and they say, if you'd have let us go, we'd have returned by now. But he says, we promise that we will make sure that we bring this boy back, as though they are trustworthy in order to bring back this favorite son, Benjamin. But Jacob eventually realizes this is what he needs to do. And so he allows them to take the boy, and so they head back to Egypt. They take extra money. They take gifts of almonds and pistachios and some other things to try to bribe this powerful Egyptian that they are terrified of. Well, when they arrive back in Egypt, the first thing they do is they find the steward, and they tell him about the money that they had found because they're afraid that he's going to accuse them of stealing. And he says, no, all of that's okay. Joseph arranges a banquet where he has all of his brothers seated according to their birth order. Now, they don't know who Joseph is. Can you imagine how discouraging and how disconcerting this might be that he knows their birth order? And he has them seated according to that. He knows things about them that he shouldn't know. And he claims that he can divine the future with this silver cup that he has. And so they're terrified. And he brings them into this banquet, and he has Benjamin sitting at the place of honor, and he gives him 5 times as much food as the rest of them to see as to whether or not, they're going to be jealous of their brother. And numerous times, Joseph just about loses it because he sees the fear in his brothers, and he sees that there is a change in their heart, that they had returned. And we don't know how long it took them before they went back. We don't know what Joseph was doing in the meantime. We don't know what he was doing with Simeon when he was in prison. All of that's a mystery, but what we do know is that they come back, and Joseph has a change of heart as he's starting to have compassion towards his brothers, but I don't think he's forgiven them yet. And I'm not sure that if he really does forgive them or not. But he sets another trap. And that when he sends the brothers back home, he has his servants take that silver cup and put it in Benjamin's sack. And then after they have left, he sends his soldiers after his brothers. And they say to the brothers, he says, "Why have you treated our master so terribly? One of you has stolen his silver cup that he uses for determining the future." Now all of the brothers deny it because they don't know that the cup is in there. And starting with the oldest, they empty their sacks and there is no cup. And then when they get to Benjamin, they open up the sack. There is the cup. Now Joseph had told his soldiers, saying that only the person who has the cup needs to come back and be my slave. Everybody else can go free. That was the test. All of them could have gone home, except for Benjamin. But they don't. They all return to Egypt. And there Judah makes this impassioned plea, where he says that the life of our father is tied up in the life of the boy. And if the boy does not return, then our father will die. And then he offers himself. He says, "Take me instead of the boy." Now, we like to think this is a story of forgiveness, right? You ever hear any of the boys say they're sorry for what we've done? Never. They feel cursed because they think God is judging them for the evil that they have done. But nowhere in the story do we ever find where they confess to God and say, "God, we're sorry for what we did to our brother." Nowhere in our story do we ever find where they say eventually to Joseph, "We're sorry for what we did to you." Confession is completely missing out of this story. Well, finally, Joseph can't take it anymore. And so he gets everybody out of the room and he reveals himself to his brothers. And he says, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" And they are absolutely terrified as to what's happening. They're not happy about this. They're terrified because they realize that this is Joseph. And they're thinking back to what had happened. Now, if you were one, here's just a theoretical, speculative question for you. If you were one of Joseph's brothers at this point, if you can put yourself in the story, what would you do at this point? How many of you would fall on your face before Joseph and beg for forgiveness and ask for mercy? "Oh, Joseph, I'm sorry I hated you. I was an idiot for selling you into slavery. Please don't kill me. I'm sorry." We don't read that in the story. None of his brothers takes the opportunity to say, "I'm sorry." They're just ignorant to the whole thing. They never offer an apology. They never confess. You ever ask why? Well, I don't think this is a story of forgiveness. What it is, it's a story of God's power and God's providence. The people never confessed, but nonetheless, God sent Joseph ahead of them in order to save a remnant. God used the awful things that happened in Joseph's life in order to bring about good. The admirable thing about Joseph is that you've heard the thing, if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And Joseph does. That is the admirable thing. Bad things keep happening to him, and by God's grace, he is able to make lemonade. But nowhere is there any place in this story where Joseph forgives his brothers, where he does anything other than to acknowledge that God is the one who has been in control, and not himself. Well, second preaching point. You and I are Joseph's brothers. We don't confess for what we have done wrong. We confess that we get caught. You hear that? I'm not sorry I lied. Sorry I got caught in my lie. I'm not sorry I cheated. I'm sorry I got caught cheating. I'm not sorry that I used deflated footballs. I'm sorry I got caught using deflated footballs. I'm not sorry I used steroids. I'm sorry I got caught using steroids. These things are right out of our headlines, aren't they? I'm not sorry I cheated the stock market. I'm sorry I got caught cheating in the stock market. Now, don't raise your hands, but how many of you, is that us? Is that you? I'm not sorry for what I did. I'm sorry that I got caught for what I did. And that's what we're finding with Joseph's brothers. They're not sorry they hated Joseph. They're not sorry they sold him into slavery. They're not sorry they took his coat of many colors. They're sorry now that the roosters have come home and that they have gotten caught. They're terrified that Joseph is going to extract vengeance upon them. Nowhere do they ever say to Joseph, please forgive us for what we have done, that we hated you. They now have to go back and tell their father. Joseph says, go back and tell my father that I am the father to Egypt, the father to Pharaoh, and that I was sent ahead of you to provide for you. So now they have to go back and they get their father. What are they going to tell Jacob? Hey, Dad, guess what? Joseph's alive. Wow, my son's alive. Yeah. Boy, are you in for a surprise when you get to talk to him and he's going to tell you why it is that he's alive. That we sold him into slavery. That we allowed you to believe a lie that he had been killed by a wild animal. Can you imagine conversation around the dinner table with this family? With what are they going to say? It's distressing. Jumping ahead several years now. Jacob dies. Joseph's brothers come to him again. This is the closest that we get to a confession. As they say to Joseph that when Dad, we know that you have been keeping us alive because of our father. Okay? The only reason you've been showing us mercy is because of Dad. And we will be your slaves. That's as close as they get to a confession. We'll be your slaves. And then they tell an outright lie. And that they say that Dad wanted you to forgive us. If Jacob wanted Joseph to forgive them, we would have had that story recorded because there were numerous conversations that we have between Joseph and Jacob. And nowhere does Jacob ever say to Joseph, oh, by the way, I want you to forgive your brothers for the horrible things they did to you. So they're lying to Joseph. And then Joseph says something that's actually very incredible and the closest that we get to forgiveness. And he says, don't be afraid. He says, I am not God. He's leaving the judgment to God, not to himself. He's not taking vengeance, even though he could. He says, what you meant for evil, but God meant it good. So did the brothers get away with it? It's become a justice issue, and we wonder, well, did they get away? No, they didn't. They lived their entire lives for 22 years while Joseph was, when they didn't know that Joseph was alive. They always lived with this cloud over their heads, thinking everything was going to fall apart on them. And even after Joseph was alive and they were discovered, they never received forgiveness because they could never confess. They lived in fear their entire lives. You realize that? They lived in fear their entire lives, even though Joseph was providing and protecting them, because they could never receive the grace of God, because they never owed up to their sins and never confessed them. They didn't get away with anything. Did Joseph forgive his brothers? I don't think he did. I don't think he ever trusted them except for Benjamin. But what he did do is he trusted God. He allowed God to bring about whatever justice needed to be done. Joseph was not looking for revenge. He had just learned that God was in control and that God was going to remain in control. So where's the good news in this story? Well, we see a couple of prototypes of what the Messiah is going to be like. From Judah, we see this incredible example where Judah offers himself as a substitute for his brother Benjamin. Jesus offered himself as a substitute for us. We see where Joseph suffers unjustly, but he suffers for 13 years. And we see that Jesus suffered for us in order to offer a grace that we do not deserve. You see, sin has a price. There's an incredible legacy of pain in the family of Abraham. You have a legacy of playing favorites, of lying, of deception, of cheating, and all of this gets passed on for 4 generations. Sin has a price, and it has a price in our lives as well. And salvation has a price. It is a great price that it took God becoming flesh and dying on a cross for us. So what's the point of the story? We've already said this before. We don't need to try to be like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Judah. Because you and I, we are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Judah. We are scoundrels. We're not good people. But where the redemption of the story comes is that God is gracious and merciful. He is slow to anger. And that even though we don't confess, God still forgives, works in our lives. I don't know if you noticed this morning in our pastoral prayer, there was no confession. Did you catch that? Probably not. There was no place where I gave us the opportunity to confess our sins, say that we are sorry. Because I want to give us the opportunity to do that now. I want a public confession. But all of us have skeletons in our life we need to confess. Some of us have a whole graveyard. We don't have a femur. We've got we have one skeleton. We've got skeletons of things that we need to confess and say that we are sorry for. So I want to give us a couple of minutes here before we sing our last song. For you, if you need to come to the altar, if you want to just kneel in front of your chair, if you want to just sit quietly, but we need to confess. To not be like Joseph's brothers. To realize that there is nothing that you confess that can make God love you less. So let us take time to